So we have a bunch of awesome panels for you today, moderated by a few amazing esports people. First, we're going to start with a keynote from Ari Segal, CEO of Immotals Gaming Club. Big round of applause for him, please.
Thanks. I'm Ari Segal, CEO of Immotals Gaming Club, and I always think it's funny when you're asked to talk about esports in emerging markets as if there's any market that's not an emerging market when it comes to esports. You know, the industry at scale has existed for less than 10 years, and I think we can all agree that 10 years from now, it will be multiples bigger than it is today. So I know that for us at IGC and my colleagues here today, Arnold from Seoul Dynasty and Gen G, and Matt Edelman from Super League Gaming, and all of the other amazing people you hear from, I think what they would tell you is part of the reason that they're spending years and years of their career in esports is because we're all part of an emerging market, and that's really exciting and rewarding. In terms of our global presence, IGC is split really between two markets today. One is Los Angeles in North America, and the other is Brazil. We operate two operating companies. One is IGC Esports, which houses our team brands, so MIBR, LA Valiant, Optic Gaming, and our flagship Immortals. Then we also operate a software platform called Gamers Club out of Brazil. You take Immortals, our flagship, you take Gamers Club, our platform, you put them together and change a few letters, and you get Immortals Gaming Club. I think it's important to note that our expansion into Brazil as an emerging market was not based on some preconceived notion that we should be in emerging markets. It's not like we sat down in a boardroom and said, you know, it would be interesting challenging ourselves to operate a business across multiple continents in different time zones, in different languages. It's more that as a function of trying to recognize that white space where teams can really differentiate and try to figure out what opportunities exist for non-publishers and non-IP owners to create IP or to create real synergy that would add value to communities that extended outside of just the core affinity group of esports fans today. We saw an amazing opportunity in Brazil, and for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about, Brazil was a natural fit for us. I think Arnold will tell you similar things about what Seoul Dynasty and Gen G are doing in Seoul in the United States. I think the biggest challenge of operating in multiple regions is culture. We have to hire everybody in Brazil from Brazil. And we need to understand the fundamentals of what drive satisfaction and performance in a culture that's entirely different than the one that we confront day to day in Los Angeles. As a startup, something that's really interesting, it's I think very easy to understand, is US, especially West Coast US young people, are much more favorably inclined towards equity than are young Brazilians of the same age. One reason for that is because Brazilians have less confidence in Brazilian public markets. And so as you think about just the very simple thing of how do you set up a payroll structure, how do you create parity role to role in two different regions, knowing that there's going to be communication and interaction between those two groups, something as simple as the way that one culture thinks about buckets of compensation can be really challenging and difficult. I think a second challenge is just local management. We're at the case that we did not have local management that we deeply trusted and respected. It would be almost impossible for us to operate this business. And so that ties into a recommendation, which Stan asked me to provide, which is if you're going to try to do business in multiple markets, have local management that you deeply trust and respect, and almost think of that as critical to the asset you're trying to create in the market. And by the way, if any of you have a venture background, would you invest in a startup where you didn't trust or have a high opinion of the founder and his or her capability? Of course not. And so you should think in some ways of an expansion into an emerging market as a startup venture for your enterprise. Another question that I was asked to talk about was, should people do it? Should people move into an emerging market? And my answer is going to be very unsatisfying, which is maybe, it depends. Is there a specific reason why you're venturing into emerging markets generally and a particular market specifically? Can you articulate it? And if so, why? What is the why that's driving you to pick something that's challenging and non-obvious? So in our case, we saw an opportunity in Brazil to combine a brand that existed and that had gone dormant in MIBR, a roster of players that were reaching their peak or just post-prime of performance, but was ubiquitous throughout the world, but deeply relevant in Brazil, and to combine that with an asset that was connected to the same players. One of the players was a founder of this business, connected to the same people. The Gamers Club platform existed only in Brazil, to the same game, Counter-Strike, but to really create a unifying mechanism for everything that we were trying to do around the MIBR brand. It was an amplification of activity that would give us real scale and reach in a market that was largely untapped by organizations like ours. That said, there are a lot of risks. Esports and gaming generally is a high-velocity, high-churn industry across every conceivable dimension. Not only does staff churn a lot, but games churn. 3 years ago, no one had heard of Fortnite. A year ago this time, we all would have been talking about Apex Legends. You have to be able to keep pace with what's happening in the industry in order to keep pace with the consumer, which is a high-velocity, high-churn consumer. And obviously, operating in different countries exposes you to not a multiple, but exponential increases of risk and output factors that you have to flow through into making decisions. And then finally, what learnings do we have as IGC that we could impart? I would say, think of every aspect of emerging market operations, particularly when your entire business is not located there, as something that requires a scalpel and not a broad brush. The tendency and the challenge when you are so far away as a manager is to want things to be simple and easy, and to make decisions like kind of with a hammer, like, yes, let's do this. And I'll give you an example of where we thought we did that and where we erred. MIBR, which we operate out of Los Angeles, but is deeply connected to our Gamers Club platform and our Brazilian operations too, is obviously a brand that resonates more in Brazil than any other country. It's called MIBR, Made in Brazil. It would be interesting if that was more popular in Canada than Brazil. I think we'd probably have picked wrong if that were the case. This thing on? That was a joke, yeah. Gotta wake this crowd up. Late lunch. In any case, we thought we were ahead of the curve. We were patting ourselves on the back when we transformed much of MIBR's primary content to Portuguese rather than English. Hey, we're an LA company doing Portuguese language content. Aren't we innovative? Aren't we ahead of the curve? But it turns out that Portuguese speakers have a different cultural sensibility than Brazilian Portuguese speakers. Just like people from the UK and America spell words differently, or connect to different kinds of content differently, or just think of themselves as very culturally different even though they speak the same language. That seems very obvious, but we tried to first paint with a broad brush rather than a scalpel. And it took really 6 months for us to unpack at a deeper level the way to structure content so that it was resonating primarily with a Portuguese Brazilian audience. And once we started to do that, once we started to have a specific niche value proposition that was not about globalization, but was very targeted towards Brazilian people in Brazil, and using that as our beachhead to expand out of, we started to create real traction. And actually, from a management standpoint, it became easier to manage. So we built a great team locally. We empowered that team to execute based on what resonated culturally. The brand, therefore, was more organic and authentic, and that has helped us get to global scale, where today, MIBR is the single biggest Counter-Strike brand in the world. So look forward to talking more on the panel later, and I think Stan Press is going to follow me here. Thank you.